2-day LCAP training. We want to thank you for joining us this morning, and good morning. Okay, we'll begin. We have a lot on the agenda today, so we'll go ahead and we'll get started. Again, good morning. I'm Adrienne Balcazar, and I'd like to introduce the LCAP State and Federal Programs Unit to you. Today joining us is Debbie, Helen, Augustine, Rachel, Jeannie, and Anita, and also our support staff, Maribel and Carol. We want to welcome all of you, and then also we have joining today the Accountability and Data Literacy Unit led by Evan Bartelheim and Dr. Hillary Wiseman. We're really excited that we're co-presenting today because, this, as we share our training today, we always emphasize that it's a team effort between program and your fiscal staff. And so we're happy that all of the program and fiscal staff are here today joining us. But also we'd like to share how we ourselves are able to, we collaborate with other units at LACO. So we're really grateful that Accountability and Data Literacy Unit is here today with us. And so we will continue. To access today's presentation, we're placing the link in the chat. Once you click on the link, it will take you to all our resources that are located on our LACO LCAP Canvas page. Once you navigate through this page, you'll scroll and you'll find today's presentation where you can download it for your own usage. The link on the slide will give you access to LACO as well as CDE LCAP resources. So we want to make sure that we have it in one place so that you have access to everything. We also want to let you know that we are recording today's training. We will be posting today's training, hopefully, soon today, thereafter we end. And then we'll also be placing the Q&A on this page as well for your convenience. Today's presentation is part one of our 2-day training. It will go over 2 separate agendas. So today the focus is going over the what about the LCAP. What do we do? What are the changes? What needs to be done? And then in day 2, we're going to go over the how in the development of your LCAP. And because there's just so much to cover regarding the LCAP, it takes about 2 days to cover most of it. So again, today we're going to look at the introduction, the overview of the LCFF and the LCAP, and then a reminder on the mid-year report. We'll take a look at the 23-24 LCAP annual update, the 24-25 LCAP template and those components, as well as the local indicators in the from our Accountability and Data Literacy Unit. As usual, please place your questions in the chat box and we will answer any simple questions that we can in the present moment. But we will be following up with written responses in a Q&A, and it will be mailed to everyone that has signed up and is participating in our 2-day training. So let's begin with the introduction and the overview of the LCAP. Let's take a look at the history of LCFF and the LCAP. This historical look will help put the past years in context of where we have been and where are we today. You can see prior to 2013, you might remember these years as focusing on standards, a lot of sanctions for not meeting those standards. It was an accountability system based on a one-size-fits-all approach. And there were many categorical programs that had a lot of restrictive fiscal allowability. And then you can see from 2013 to 2019, there was the introduction of the California Way. And it was the start of the LCFF, the Local Control Funding Formula, and the beginning of the Local Control Accountability Plan known as the LCAP. And the accountability approach was looking more about continuous improvement. This model was really allowing districts and LEAs to focus on who knows better on what needs to be done at the local level, and that is You all, all of you. So again, it was not about punishing, it was about a continuous improvement, taking stock of where you are today and moving forward. And then 2020-21 hit, and we all know what happened, the pandemic. And the accountability system was disrupted and everything was placed on hold. And then 2021 and all the way to 2024 with the next template was a time of rebuilding, not only in the LCAP, but actually in our lives. And so the accountability system was kind of piecemealed. And you remember last year there were cell phone bars for the accountability, but now, you know, it was slowly getting back on track. And then now, as we look to the future, where we are today with the new template of the 2024-27, it's a new 3-year cycle. And the 24-25 LCAP template instructions are allowing for this re-engagement of the California way with the use of the dashboard, specific use of state and local data to guide the work that we do for the students. And so you can look at it as a time to reflect, a time to refresh, renew, and refine all the work that everyone is doing. And so again, as we look forward, we want to preface this whole new template with, it's not a, let's just take what we did last year and roll it over and continue doing what we're doing. It's really a time to reflect and to really look, and the new template kind of forces you to do that because you do need to have data. You need to review and reflect on what took place in the last 3 years and what needs to change. And so that requires some collaboration between all your educational partners, all the different units at your LEA, and you know, just having that candid, honest communication and conversation. And it's all around what's best for students. So here we go. So within the California way, the funds that are used are called LCFF, or local control funding formula funds. The LCFF funds are comprised of base funds, which are based on the average daily attendance and based on grade span adjustments. Then there are supplemental grant funds, and these are additional LCFF funds provided to every LEA based on the LEA's unduplicated pupil count. The supplemental grant funds are equal to 20% of the adjusted base grant multiplied by the ADA and the unduplicated pupil percentage. And then we have the concentration grant funds that are additional LCFF funds provided with the unduplicated pupil percentage over 55%. Concentration funds is equal to 65% of the adjusted base grant multiplied by the ADA and unduplicated pupil percentage exceeding 55%. Then, starting in 2021, funds in the Budget Act of 2021 were given to LEAs with an unduplicated pupil percentage over 55%. And these funds are now part of the concentration grant funds, but they have specific use. They are to be used to increase the number of staff at schools that are over 55% unduplicated pupil percentage, as compared to schools with an unduplicated pupil percentage equal or below 55. So again, that is why it's part of it, but it is something that transpired over the years. And then lastly, we know that legislation changed the requirements that the unmet portion of the minimum proportionality percentage, the MPP, as we call it, that an LEA must now carry over into the coming year, into the coming LCAP year. And this is calculated through the LCAP action tables, the carryover table specifically. So the requirement for the funding is that LEAs must meet their minimum proportionality percentage, the MPP, and how they will do this is through increasing or improving services for English learners, including long-term English learners, foster youth, and low-income students, including homeless population, in proportion to the amount of supplemental and concentration dollars that they are receiving. And LEAs can meet their MPP, again, by increasing or improving services for the unduplicated students. So now let's take a look at the overview of the LCFF and the LCAP. If you have been in the LCAP world for a while, you will have heard about a through line. So because there are so many components within the LCAP, it's important that the LEA be intentional with a consistent narrative throughout the document. It should be clear for the reader. And remember, again, the template and the reading of it is for the reader and your instructions are for the writer. So as parents and all your educational partners are reading the LCAP, they should be able to see a through line that is consistent throughout the whole LCAP. And it's going to tell the story about what the LEA has done and the impact that it has had on the students and what do they plan to do to address the local needs of their students and community. The function of the LCAP development process is extremely important. The development of the LCAP cannot be written or completed in isolation. And so we're glad that you have many people here because again, it's a joint effort. It's not one person doing all of it. It's truly a process that focuses on the continuous improvement for all students, not just your unduplicated students, but this plan is really looking at all of the needs of all your students. And with this, the comprehensive strategic planning, particularly to address and reduce the disparities in opportunities for students and also outcomes. So looking at data that's going to be identified in the California dashboard will help identify any of those disparities between various student groups. It's also focused on increased or improved services specifically for the low-income foster youth and English learner with the use of supplemental and concentration funds. And it's also important to know that the decisions and the deep and meaningful engagement of your educational partners within the school community and the community at large. And again, we're making sure that the decisions that are made are made at the local level because you all know what's best for your students. So this is again a time to turn what you must do, which is the LCAP, turn it into what you want to do, and that is to focus on the success of all students. When you're writing your LCAP, there are specific legal requirements that must be met, and here are some of them. LEAs are required to develop, adopt, and annually update a 3-year LCAP using the template adopted by the State Board of Education. And this again means adherence to the instructions in the adopted template. So again, not just answering the prompts that you see in the template, but actually adhering to all the instructions that are included in the instructions of the template. The LCAP also must include a description of the goals to be achieved for each student group, for each state priority, and for any local priorities identified by the local governing board or body. And lastly, the LCAP must include an annual review of the effectiveness of the goals and actions from the prior year. And so when you look at the LCAP, that's exactly what the template is doing. And so when you have completed all of the components of the 24-25 LCAP and are ready to post and formally submit the LCAP, it must be assembled as one document in the following order. You'll have your budget overview for parents, the 23-24 annual update, and you'll have your 24-25 LCAP template with those components within it. The action tables, there's still five action tables, and then the instructions. So again, when you're compressing and putting all of those, stringing all of those documents together, whether it's through our ELCAP system or the your own document or through doc tracking, again, remember instructions are also part of the requirement for posting and for submitting. And so thank you. I will now turn it over to Anita.
Thank you, Adrienne. And before we begin with the first part of the LCAP template, we wanted to take a moment to remind everyone about the mid-year update report. All LEAs, whether a school district, a charter school, or a county office of education, shall present a mid-year update report on the annual update to the LCAP and the LCFF budget overview for parents on or before February 28th of each year at a regularly scheduled meeting of the board or governing body as it relates to your LEA. The report requirements are as follows. All available mid-year outcome data related to the metrics identified in the current year's LCAP. All available mid-year expenditure data on all actions identified in the current year's LCAP, and all available implementation data on all actions identified in the current year's LCAP. And so here are just a few quick reminders. LEAs are not required to use any specific template. The mid-year update is not adopted by the board or the governing body, but rather it's an informational report. The mid-year update is not submitted to the county office and is not a part of the 24-25 LCAP submission. Compliance for the mid-year update report requirement will be through the annual fiscal audit. And we have heard from many of you that you already have the report complete and you're ready to present to your boards in February. That's awesome. And okay, that was it. So we are ready to get into the LCAP template, and Rachel will start us off with the 23-24 LCAP annual update. Rachel?
Thank you, Anita. And good morning, everyone. So as Anita mentioned, in this section, we'll be taking a look at the 2023-24 LCAP annual update. So for this year, the 23-24 LCAP annual update will be completed in a standalone document in order to close out the previous 3-year cycle. In previous years, this annual update was embedded in the LCAP template through the measuring and reporting results section and the goal analysis prompts. However, with the start of a new 3-year cycle, a standalone template is needed to allow LEAs to address any goals, actions, or metrics that will not be continued into the 2024-25 plan. Moving forward, the annual update will be embedded within the LCAP template as in previous years. So the annual update process will essentially lay the foundation for the development of the 24-25 LCAP. And in looking at the graphic at the bottom of the slide, you can see that this process really starts with the mid-year update. The information gathered during the mid-year update should feed into the annual update process. And the 2023-24 annual update will in turn inform the development of your 24-25 plan. So with the new 3-year cycle, it's really an opportunity for LEAs to reflect on the goals, actions, expenditures, and metrics over the past 3 years. Using data and input from educational partners, LEAs will have to determine if their actions have been successful in achieving their desired outcomes. It's also a time for LEAs to refresh and refine the work they've been doing, as Adrian previously mentioned. So LEAs will need to determine if they're going to adopt actions that have proven successful, adapt actions that have not produced the desired results, or abandon those actions that have not been effective. And so the annual update is a bridge between the prior 3-year LCAP and the new 2024-25 LCAP. The reflection and analysis through the annual update process will inform the development of your new plan. So here we've included a screenshot of the first page of the 23-24 annual update template. Most of the information will need to be copied verbatim or rolled over from the 23-24 LCAP. So for those LEAs that use an electronic system, such as the LCAP system, this information will be rolled over for you from the 2023-24 LCAP. On this page, you can see that LEAs will only need to complete the year 3 outcome for each metric included in the 23-24 LCAP. And some of this work may have already been completed for some metrics through the mid-year update process. specifically for those metrics where the year 3 outcomes are already known at this point in the year. For the year 3 outcome, the instructions specify that LEAs are to enter the most recent data available and must also indicate the school year to which the data applies. So here we see page 2 of the annual update template, which includes the 4 goal analysis prompts that LEAs will need to complete. LEAs will only need to complete these 4 prompts within this 2023-24 annual update template. So you will see that these 4 goal analysis prompts are also included within the 24-25 template. However, for this year, the goal analysis prompts included in the 24-25 LCAP template are not applicable. The first 2 prompts have not changed from last year. However, there have been some changes to prompts 3 and 4, which we'll be taking a closer look at in a few slides. Here we see the 2023-24 annual update table and the 23-24 contributing actions annual update table. Although the annual update action tables are not physically located within the annual update template, it's important to keep in mind that they are part of the annual update, and the information from the tables will inform your responses to the prompts, specifically prompts 1 and 2. So for the first goal analysis prompt, you can see a screenshot of the prompt and the instructions below it. And as Adrian previously mentioned, the prompts are for the reader and the instructions are for the writer. So the outward-facing prompt is asking for a description of any substantive differences in planned actions and the actual implementation of these actions. However, you can see that the instructions below ask for a bit more. So based on the instructions, LEAs must address several components within the response, including the overall implementation of the actions, the challenges related to the implementation of the actions, the successes related to implementation of the actions, and also any actions that were not implemented or were implemented in a manner that was substantively different than what was planned must be described in the response. Also keep in mind that all actions must be addressed in the response. So for example, an LEA might indicate something like, all actions were implemented as planned except for actions 4 and 5. Then the LEA would need to describe why actions 4 and 5 were not implemented as planned. Additionally, the LEA would then describe any challenges and successes related to the implementation of the actions in that specific goal. Prompt 2 asks LEAs for an explanation of any material differences between budgeted expenditures and estimated actual expenditures. Additionally, the prompt asks for an explanation of any material differences between planned percentages of improved services and estimated actual percentages of improved services, if applicable. So this second component would only apply to limited actions without funding. Another important thing to note is that the response to this prompt is directly connected to the annual update tables. The annual update tables is where we would see those material differences between what the LEA planned to spend and the estimated actual expenditures. And just as another reminder, there should also be a through line between prompts 1 and 2 and the annual update tables. So for example, if in prompt 1 you indicate that an action was not implemented, then we would expect there to be an explanation of the material differences for that action in prompt 2, since the action was not implemented. And then the annual update table would show the estimated actuals of $0 for that action. So prompt 3 asks for an explanation of how effective or ineffective the actions were in making progress toward the goal during the 3-year LCAP cycle. Now, this is slightly different this year because LEAs must also address the ineffectiveness. And another difference is that you're looking at the effectiveness or ineffectiveness over the entirety of the previous 3-year LCAP cycle, and not just the 2023-24 LCAP year. The instructions define effectiveness as the degree to which actions were successful in producing the desired result, and ineffectiveness as the actions did not produce any significant or desired result. So LEAs will need to compare their yearly outcome data to their desired outcome for 2023-24 for each metric in the LCAP, as well as consider related educational partner feedback to determine the degree to which the actions were successful in producing the desired result. It's also important to note that all actions must be addressed within this response. And when responding to this prompt, LEAs have the option of addressing the actions individually or grouping the actions within the goal based on performance on a single metric or a group of specific metrics. And so it's up to the LEA to determine which approach to use as long as all actions are addressed within the response. Another new piece this year is that LEAs must change actions that have not proven effective over a 3-year period. And this leads us to prompt 4, which is where you would address those changes to ineffective actions. So here we see the 4th goal analysis prompt. And this prompt asks LEAs to describe any changes made to the goal, expected outcomes, metrics, or actions as a result of this analysis and analysis of the dashboard data or any other local data. And so this piece is not new. So you'll remember for the past few years, LEAs have been asked to address any changes within this prompt. What's new this year is the piece about changing actions that have not proven effective over the previous 3-year LCAP cycle. So for those actions that the LEA has identified as ineffective in prompt 3, the LEA has to change those actions. And the response to this prompt must identify the ineffective action, provide the reason for the ineffectiveness, and also describe how the changes to the action will result in a new or strengthened approach. So just to summarize the goal analysis prompts, the focus of prompt 1 is really on the implementation of actions. So are the actions being implemented as planned and described in your LCAP? Prompt 2 is about material differences. Is spending consistent with what was budgeted? Or are you spending significantly more or less than what was planned? Prompt 3 is about effectiveness or ineffectiveness. So are the actions working and making progress towards the goal? And how do you know? And finally, prompt 4 is about changes. So what changes will you make for the 2024-25 LCAP based on this reflection and analysis? So remember, the annual update process, including the reflection and the goal analysis and feedback from your educational partners, should guide the development of your 24-25 plan. And so again, this is the start of a new 3-year cycle, and it's a time to reflect, refresh, and refine all the work you've been doing, rather than just rolling over the current plan. And so that concludes this section. I will now turn it over to Jeannie for the plan summary.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be with all of you this morning. Our presentation will now address the template and the requirements for the 2024-25 LCAP, and we'll start with the plan summary. This is the first section for the plan the LEA is developing for the upcoming 24-25 school year. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll see here the big idea of the plan summary. This plan summary is where LEAs share context for their LCAP plan for the upcoming school year. This context provides general information about the LEA's community and includes specific information about student needs and their performance in state priority areas. The information connects to performance of all students and student groups, as well as highlights disparity of outcomes. The response in this section intentionally provides a meaningful connection to the content included in the subsequent sections of the LCAP. And we will take a look at each of the prompts included in the plan summary, as well as with all of the LCAP templates. Direct your attention to what is included in the instructions in order to support an understanding of what must be included in each response. So we'll start with the general information section. In this section, LEAs will describe information about the LEA, its schools, and its students. This information will support the educational partners and readers and the public to understand what is being addressed in the plan. LEAs will determine what information to include to address each of these three areas. The instructions include a frame for providing information about the LEA in terms of geography, enrollment, employment, as well as the number and size of specific schools, as well as recent community challenge, to offer what may be among the information that the LEA selects to include in this general information section to address these three areas. A new requirement is included in this general information section. This addresses LEAs that have schools that are eligible to receive equity multiplier funds for use in specific goals beginning in the 24-25 LCAP. In this section, LEAs need to identify the schools receiving these funds. School-level eligibility for equity multiplier funding will be based on prior year non-stability rates greater than 25% and prior year socioeconomically disadvantaged pupil rates greater than 70%. This is a new requirement, and the CDE will be posting a list of eligible schools soon. You will also see a connection to these eligible schools specifically addressed in the Engaging Educational Partners section, as well as in the Goals and Actions section of the template. The next section addresses annual performance. The annual performance section requires LEAs to reflect on their annual performance of the dashboard and their annual performance using local data. This is where all LEAs are describing a reflection of the performance of the LEA, student groups, and school-level performance using data from the dashboard as well as local data. This may include areas where the LEA identified successes as well as challenges as they engage in looking at their dashboard data and local data sources during their development process for the LCAP for the 24-25 school year. In this prompt, LEAs are encouraged to highlight how they are addressing identified needs of student groups and our schools within the LCAP as part of the response. The second component is a new component included in this section, and this is based on performance ratings on the 2023 dashboard that are specific. Here, LEAs need to also identify in their response areas where the LEA received the lowest performance level on the dashboard. This response needs to identify schools within the LEA with one or more state indicators on the dashboard, student groups within the LEA, as well as student groups within a school that received the lowest performance level on the dashboard. Okay. In most cases, this will be the performance level indicated by a red rating on the dashboard. For the college and career indicator, this will be reflected with the cell phone bars. These lowest performance levels will remain unchanged during the 3-year LCAP cycle. And so in this way, LEAs will annually reflect on this performance to show where outcomes are improving for these schools, student groups, and for the LEA level performance. And so this section, this response that will remain unchanged for the 3-year cycle, okay, it means this same response will be included next year in the plan summary. Moving on to the next section. Technical assistance. This is a new component included in the plan summary section. This section applies to all LEAs eligible for technical assistance. For most LEAs, this applies to those eligible for differentiated assistance, which addresses any student groups for which the LEA has the lowest student group performance in 2 or more state priority areas on the dashboard. The DA process assists LEAs to reflect on addressing underlying causes that led to low student outcomes, while strengthening the LEA's overall capacity to evaluate the effectiveness of strategies and programs and making adjustments as appropriate to address these specific student groups. And so here, LEAs provide a summary of their work underway as part of the assistance process. Next slide, please. Comprehensive support and improvement. Okay, this is a continuing section, and this last section addresses the requirement for schools that are eligible for comprehensive support and improvement. Per ESSA, these schools are annually identified using the California School Dashboard to determine school eligibility for, as well as exit criteria from comprehensive support and improvement. School eligibility and exit criteria are determined for the following categories: low graduation rate and identifying not less than the lowest performing 5% of Title I funded schools. CDE will be releasing the data file soon for these eligible schools. We'll take a look now at each of the prompts. The first prompt, number 1, requires the LEA to identify the eligible schools. This is very self-explanatory. You'll be using the ESSA assistance status sheet and identifying the eligible schools. The second prompt addresses how the LEA has or will support the identified schools in developing CSI plans. Here, LEAs need to connect to the requirements that are included in the instructions. From the instructions, you will see the response requires a description of how the LEA has or will support the eligible schools to conduct and engage their educational partners in a school-level needs assessment. Additionally, LEAs need to describe how they have or will support their schools to consider and identify evidence-based interventions to address their needs. And a third component is the process that the LEA will use or has used to support these schools to identify any resource inequities to be addressed through the implementation of the CSI plan. So in addition to directing your attention to these 3 components that need to be included in this response, we've offered some links for guidance from the Department of Education that addresses evidence-based interventions. Additionally, a link is included for resources from the Alliance for Equity, which offers dimensions of equity that can be helpful in identifying areas of resource inequity that need to be addressed. And now we'll move to the final prompt in this section, which is monitoring and evaluating effectiveness. This addresses how the LEA will support the school or schools to monitor and evaluate their implementation and effectiveness of their CSI plan to support student group and school level improvement. We'll move on to the next slide to highlight some of the key changes in this section of the plan summary for the 24-25 LCAP. These changes respond to statute revisions requiring an intentional focus on identifying and addressing disparity of outcomes. It is important to note that LEAs will need to access data files to identify and organize the dashboard data and local data they will include in these prompts in a manner that's meaningful and accessible to their educational partners. You will see in the subsequent sections that these new components connected to the data reflection will connect to other sections, which include designing actions and metrics for state priorities and addressing the identified lowest performance categories, as well as focus goals for equity multiplier schools, as well as designing specific actions related to the work underway to address the underlying causes for specific student groups that are eligible for differentiated assistance. And that concludes the plan summary section. I'm going to hand it off to Adrienne to address the engaging educational partners section.
Thank you, Jeannie. So after the plan summary, the next section is the engaging educational partners. The purpose of the engaging educational partners section is to ensure that there is significant and purposeful, meaningful engagement of your parents, students, educators, and other educational partners, including those representing the student groups identified by LCFF. This engagement is critical to the development of your LCAP and the budget process because they possess valuable perspectives and insights. The engagement of educational partners is an ongoing and a continuous process. It's really about parents feeling that they're part of the process instead of just going to a scheduled meeting about the LCAP. This section is also designed to reflect on how the engagement with educational partners really influenced the decisions that are reflected in the adopted LCAP. The 24-25 LCAP template now has 2 prompts instead of 3 as last year's or the previous template. Prompt 1 is a summary of the process used to engage educational partners in the development of the LCAP. And prompt 2 is focused on a description of how the adopted LCAP was influenced by the feedback provided by the educational partners. And so the instructions are saying, describe the goals, metrics, actions, or budgeted expenditures in the LCAP that were influenced by or developed in response to the educational partner feedback. The engaging educational partners has specific requirements for school districts, county office of education, and charter schools. They must at a minimum consult with teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, local bargaining units for districts and county offices only, parents and students in the development of the LCAP. And as mentioned before, for any LEA receiving equity multiplier funds, there must be consultation with the educational partners at the school or schools generating the equity multiplier funds in the development of the LCAP, specifically in the development of the required focus goals for each applicable school. As a reminder, before adopting the LCAP, school districts and counties and applicable to charter schools using the LCAP as their SPSA They must share it with the committees that it applies to, the Parent Advisory Committee and English Learner Parent Advisory Committee. The superintendent is required by statute to respond in writing to the comments that were received from these committees. And there must also be consultation with the special education local plan area administrator, as known as a SELPA. And the superintendent of the school district shall notify members of the public of the opportunity to submit written comments regarding the specific actions and expenditures proposed to be included in the LCAP or the annual update to the LCAP. So with the new template, it's important to note some key changes. So there is a new format in prompt 1. It's a table now, and the table requires you in the first column to identify the specific educational partners, and the second part is a summary of how they were engaged in the LCAP development process. A sufficient response to this prompt would include general information about the timeline of the process and meetings and other engagement strategies that were used with the educational partners. And if you are any LEA or charter school receiving the equity multiplier funds, you're also going to include here a summary of who and how the consultation took place with the educational partners at those schools that are generating the equity multiplier funds and in the development of the LCAP, specifically for the required focus goal for each of those schools receiving the funds. And then in prompt 2, this prompt requires a description of how the feedback from the educational partners influenced the development of the goals, metrics, actions, or budget expenditures in the LCAP. And so again, it should be clear and have specific information about how this engagement process influenced the development of the LCAP. And so again, making sure that it's reflected in prompt 2. And also, again, in prompt 2, if you're a school or you have schools that are receiving the equity multiplier funds, there must be a description about how that consultation with the educational partners actually influenced, or what areas were influenced by this interaction in how it's reflected. And it should be reflected in your LCAP. So keep in mind, as you work with your educational partners this year, that the engagement process you have in place should provide the feedback that's needed in order to show how the feedback influenced the decisions that were made and are reflected in your LCAP. So again, it is not an event, it is a process, and parents should be able to, all parents should have awareness and have the availability or some options of being connected to your district and or charter school, as well as the LCAP and the process of developing the LCAP. And so now I will turn it over to Debbie.
Thank you, Adrienne. Good morning, everyone. Augustine and I are going to talk to you about the goals and action section. So the purpose of the goal and action section is twofold. One, to identify the goals and why it's needed, and how the LEA will monitor the goal and accomplish the goal, and how the fiscal resources will be used to implement the actions of the goal. And secondly, and really very important, as Adrienne has stressed, is to communicate all of this information to your educational partners. Next slide, please. So developing the LCAP, as everyone has reminded you, is a process of continuous improvement. Adrienne shared earlier that the LCAP came into being from the state's efforts to reduce redundancy and to give local control to the LEAs in their decision making, and to include educational partners in that process. And the planning process is continuous. It's intended to give your educational partners a voice and input, and to support ongoing use of data to drive instructional decision making, to regularly monitor progress and make adjustments and decisions as you need to meet the needs of all of your students. Next slide, please. So the development of the goals, the why statement, metrics, and actions. And the actions are informed the LEA's progress on each of the state and local priorities and the educational partners' input, the local context needed, and the availability of resources to support the actions is all included here. This is the part of the goal section. So in general, the well-developed goals are clear and they communicate to educational partners what the LEA plans to accomplish, and they're aligned to the why statement and the metrics used to measure and report the results in this section and the actions used to implement this goal. Next slide, please. So the type of goal, this is new to our template, and the type of goal is not new to our writing, but stating what type of goal this is new on our template this year. And the LCAP instructions identify 4 types of goals in the template that to be used. So first is a focus goal, and it's a targeted goal that requires more specific and data-intensive approach. Then there's new this year, the equity multiplier focus goal, and this is for those schools that are identified receiving equity multiplier funds. And this goal has some specific requirements detailed in the instructions that apply both to the goal description and the explanation for why the goal was developed. Then there's the broad goal and the maintenance of progress goals. And these are both the standard goals that most LEAs have been implementing in the past LCAP cycles, whether or not it was stated, but these are typically the goals that we see in our LCAPs. And while there's now, excuse me, there's now a requirement for goals receiving equity multiplier funds. The new template no longer has a required goal for consistently low performing student groups, nor for low performing schools within the LEA. So those were previously required in the last LCAP cycle, but no longer required in this cycle. Next slide, please. What continues to be required is that we meet all of the LCAP-State priorities. And here, this is new to this section, is that you're going to state the priority. You're going to list the state priorities addressed by the goal. And at a minimum, your LCAP must address all of the LCFF priorities and associated metrics. And that's, again, a minimum. In this section of the template, you will explicitly list the state priorities addressed by the goal. So LEA should prioritize their goals and their specific actions and related expenditures included in the LCAP within one or more state priorities. And you should consider the performance on the state and local indicators, including the locally collected data for local indicators that are included in the dashboard, and determining whether and how to prioritize your goals within the LCAP. Excuse me. Next slide, please. In general, the why statement. The why statement explains why the goal was developed. The information included in the why statement will vary according to the type of goal that's being written. In a focus goal, the why needs to explain the reason the LEA has chosen to prioritize this goal and how the LEA identified it for focused attention based on the dashboard and locally collected data, as well as input from educational partners. In a broad goal, the why needs to explain why the goal was developed and how the action and metrics grouped together will help to achieve the goal. And in a maintenance goal, the why needs to explain how the actions will sustain the progress exemplified by the related metrics. And as a best practice, the why statement for each type of goal should include a description of the data and feedback from educational partners that led to its development. And one more important note, when you're completing the 24-25 LCAP, you're going to use the 23-24 local, the LCAP annual update template to complete the goal analysis. And in the 24-25 LCAP, you would write in the goal analysis section, not applicable. And now Augustine is going to share information about metrics and actions within our goal section.
Awesome. Good morning. Thank you, Debbie. Good morning, everyone. And as we progress through the arrow at the top right of our slide, we move to the measuring and reporting results subsection of the LCAP template. In just a bit, our colleagues from accountability and data literacy will share a helpful tool for selecting metrics to measure and report results. In the meantime, let's differentiate between metrics and actions, and then touch on some legal requirements related to metrics. So first, let's talk a little bit about the difference between metrics and actions. A metric indicates the unit of measurement for an expected outcome, whereas an action is something that is done to cause the expected outcome. For example, your metric could be suspension rate, identified as percentage. Your expected outcome can be that you plan to reduce suspensions by 5%. Your action might be staff training and PBIS. Remember, measuring is not an action, and an action is not an outcome. Shifting our attention to the red text box, there's a requirement in the LCAP to address the LCAP-State priorities, and it states that at a minimum, the LCAP must address all LCFF priorities and associated metrics articulated in Ed Code sections 52060D and 52066D as applicable to the LEA. The LCFF State Priority Summary linked on this slide provides a summary of both Ed Codes to aid in the development of the LCAP. So now that we talked about the difference between a metric and an action, let's continue with how to fill out the measuring and reporting results table, also known as the metrics table. For the 24-25 LCAP, LEAs will complete the metric number, the metric, baseline, and target for year 3 outcome columns. Year 1 outcome, year 2 outcome, and current difference from baseline will not be reported in the 24-25 LCAP. Note that page 14 of the instructions provides specific instructions for charter schools related to the measuring and reporting results table. It's important to note that for each LCAP year, the LEA will identify the metrics that it will use to track progress towards the expected outcomes. LEAs must identify metrics for specific student groups as appropriate, including expected outcomes that address and reduce disparities in outcomes between student groups. The metrics may be quantitative or qualitative, but at a minimum, an LEA's LCAP must include goals that are measured using all of the applicable metrics for the related state priorities in each LCAP year as applicable to the type of LEA. To the extent a state priority does not specify one or more metrics, the LEA must identify a metric to use within the LCAP. For these state priorities, LEAs are encouraged to use metrics based on or reported through the relevant local indicator self-reflection tools within the dashboard. And now, as promised, here are our colleagues from Assessment and Data Literacy with a presentation on required metrics. Take it away, guys.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Evan Bartelheim. I'm the Project Director for Accountability and Data Literacy. Actually, could you bring that slide back up for a second, Helen? We wanted to share with you a tool that we've shared in the past. We always update it. This is our LCAP required metrics tool. And we developed this to assist our LEAs in understanding what the required metrics are, those that are specified in Education Code 52060. And in this tool, we identify each of the required metrics, and we include the specific Ed Code reference for that metric, the available data sources, which may include Dashboard, DataQuest, CalPads, or others. Any special considerations, such as the difference in how measures are calculated between the different data sources. And the tool also includes links to relevant resources, such as the Dashboard Technical Guide or the Connecting CalPads to the Dashboard Handbook. We do update this tool regularly to reflect the changes that are regularly occurring with the release of new data, for example. And to ensure that users always have the most current version, we've put this into Google Slides. We recommend you bookmark it, so you'll always know you'll have the most current version. I'm now going to give you just a very brief tour of the tool, and we just know we will dive deeper into this tool on day 2. So, like I said, the tool is in Google Docs, and the link is in today's presentation. It's shared in the presentation as well as on the Canvas page. But what we've done, we have a brief intro section with some of the main links, but we dive right in, and you can see that in this case, we have 3 columns: required LCAP metric. It's identifying the specific Ed code, parsing that out, and then we identify the primary data sources. And in this case, the primary data source, one of the more complicated ones, is that teacher assignment monitoring outcomes report data. This is tricky, and in fact, a good example why we think this is a pretty helpful tool. There is a difference. Priority one of the local indicators requires that you now report the teacher assignment monitoring data specifically, but the LCAP still requires only that you report your teacher assignment data, and they do allow the CDE. I just confirmed with them. Still allow for local data source fees. So, you may want to use the teacher assignment data to line up exactly with what will be in the local indicator, but you don't have to. So these are some of the nuances that are outlined there. And then we go into some additional considerations, and we do provide resources and links to external tools and other things you may want to review just to better understand the tools. And we go through in order based on the education code order, the sequence of orders. And many of these are pretty straightforward. I will point out a few of them are things that you really can only get through your CalPADS data. There are a couple of I guess kind of somewhat archaic metrics, including middle school dropout data that really can only be generated through CalPADS. But those are all specified in here, and exactly which reports you need to run to get those, things like that are all specified. So like I said, we'll go into greater detail on our next meeting of this, but the link is available, and we do encourage you to check back off and bookmark it so you'll always have it.
Awesome. Thank you, Evan. So in addition to the required metrics just covered by Evan, here we take a look at 2 key changes for required metrics in this new LCAP cycle. First, for each action that's identified as contributing towards the requirement to increase or improve services for foster youth, English learners, including long-term English learners, and low-income students, and is also being provided on an LEA-wide basis, the LEA must identify one or more metrics to monitor the effectiveness of the action and its budgeted expenditures. And second, for each equity multiplier goal, the LEA must identify the specific metrics for each identified student group at each specific school site as applicable to measure the progress towards the goal. And these are our student groups with the lowest performance level. And the specific metrics used to measure progress in meeting the goal related to credentialing, subject matter preparation, or educator retention at each specific school site. So at the far right of our arrow at the top, we have our actions. The actions subsection identifies actions for all pupils to achieve the goals, addressing state and locally identified priorities. For each action, LEAs provide an action number, short title for the action, a specific description of the action, the total funds to carry out the action, and an indication of whether the action is contributing towards the increased or improved services for unduplicated students' requirement. The development of actions, planned expenditures, and determination of whether an action is contributing is informed by progress on each of the LCFF priorities and local priorities, input from educational partners, and identified needs. And right about now, some of you may be asking, what does it mean for an action to be contributing? Well, a contributing action is designed to increase or improve the quality or quantity of services for the low-income, foster youth, or English learner students in your schools and district. These contributing actions are designed to address a specific identified need, condition, or circumstance of these specific students. Simply put, contributing actions will increase or improve services for unduplicated pupils as compared to the services the LEA provides to all students, and this should be clear to all of your educational partners. So to fill out the actions table, you start with the action number. Many LEAs use the goal.action format. For example, 3.4 would be goal 3 action 4, while other LEAs just write it out, goal 3 action 4. Title, provide a short title for the action. This title will also appear in the action tables. Description, provide a brief but specific description of the action. For actions that contribute to meeting the increased or improved services requirement, the LEA may include an explanation of how each action is principally directed toward and effective in meeting the LEA's goals for unduplicated students as described in the instructions for the increased or improved services section. This description may also include the identification of one or more specific metrics to measure the effectiveness of the actions being provided on an LEA-wide basis. Total funds. Here you enter the total amount of expenditures associated with this action. Budgeted expenditures from specific fund sources will be provided in the action tables. And finally, contributing. Indicate whether the action contributes to meeting the increased or improved services requirement as described in the increased or improved services section using a Y for yes and an N for no. For each contributing action, the LEA is required to provide a description in the increased or improved services section of the LCAP. In addition to the requirement that our actions be designed for all pupils to achieve the goals addressing state and locally identified priorities, the next two slides highlight new requirements for LEAs to include specific actions in the LCAP. The requirement to include specific actions in the LCAP for English learners related to language acquisition programs and professional development programs has been expanded. The requirement now applies also specifically to long-term English learners when LEAs have 15 or more LTELs. This aligns to the Ed Code revision that identifies long-term English learners as a specific student group when there are 15 or more LTELs in an LEA. So if an LEA has both 30 or more ELs and 15 or more LTELs, the LEAs must include specific actions for both English learners and long-term English learners to address each of the components. Another new requirement is included for LEAs that are eligible for technical assistance, which is most commonly determined for LEAs that are eligible for differentiated assistance. These LEAs must include specific actions within the LCAP related to its implementation of the work underway as part of technical assistance or DA. You may remember from a few slides back that LEAs are also addressing the work underway in the plan summary section that provides the reflection on technical assistance. And finally, a third requirement for the actions addresses red indicators on the 2023 dashboard. LEAs must include one or more specific actions in the LCAP for red indicators for a school within the LEA, a student group within the LEA, and a student group within any school within the LEA. Using the dashboard, LEAs will need to be sure to identify any red indicators and then determine underlying causes as they develop actions that respond to these lowest performing indicators identified on the dashboard. These required actions will be effective for the 3-year LCAP cycle. So now I'll pass the baton right back to Debbie.
Thank you, Augustine. Okay, so we understand, for those of you who have been writing LCAPs for a while, the required actions Augustine just shared with those 3 categories of low performing groups might have caused you a lot or a little stress and concern. But we want you to have no doubt that when the team first learned about it, we had the same concerns and questions. And we want to be sure to communicate that as you analyze your data, you might find that many of the needs identified in your data overlap for different student groups. And therefore, you might be able to group your needs together and address them within the same action as demonstrated on the screen. So if we look at that, the 3 rectangles there, we have the LEA, this sample data is the LEA eligible for differentiated assistance based on the performance of students with disabilities. The LEA student group with students with disabilities is in the red for ELA, and 2 elementary schools with students had 2 students with disabilities in the red for ELA. So those 3 are requiring, those 3 data points require an action, but you could address that with one action to meet those 3 needs. So we want you to be aware of that, and as you analyze your data, really consider those things that might overlap and be addressed with one action. And now I'm turning over to Helen for increased and improved services.
Okay, just kidding, it's me, it's Anita. Helen is coming up right after me. Thank you, Debbie. And so moving on through the template, we get to the improved or increased services section. And here we'll take a look at the requirements of supplemental and concentration funds and the necessary components for contributing actions. Okay, so you'll recall that earlier in the presentation, Adrian went over the local control funding formula and how funds are formulated. But before we delve into the requirements for this section, it's important to review the LCFF, even if just briefly. The first two bluish squares on this slide represent an LEA's LCFF base funding. Supplemental and concentration grants noted in the green and yellow squares, sometimes referred to S and C funds, are critical in the improved or increased section. Next slide, please. The intent of the increased or improved services requirement is to identify and address the needs of unduplicated students to improve outcomes of those students. We are all aware that English learners, foster youth, and low-income students have unique and challenging needs. The number of unduplicated students across our state is impressive and substantial. And with the additional supplemental and concentration funds provided, LEAs are better equipped and required to provide increased or improved services to these students with these funds. The increased or improved section of the LCAP provides a dedicated space where LEAs can inform its educational partners how it plans to meet its equity obligation to increase or improve services for its unduplicated students in grades TK through 12 as compared to all students in grades TK through 12. By thoughtfully identifying the needs of students who are English learner, foster youth, and low income, designing and implementing actions to improve or increase services, and determining the measurement of effectiveness, LEAs operationalize equity for these students. The increased or improved services section begins with a table where LEAs specify projected supplemental and concentration grant funds for the coming 24-25 LCAP year. Complete the table as indicated in the instructions. However, pay particular attention to the total percentage to increase or improve services for the coming school year noted by the red star. This percentage is the sum of the projected percentage to increase or improve services for the 24-25 school year and the LCFF carryover percentage in S&C funds from the 23-24 school year. This is the LEA's total percentage by which services for unduplicated pupils must be increased or improved as compared to the services provided to all students in the LCAP year. This percentage is often referred to as MPP. So a couple of key points about MPP, short for minimum proportionality percentage. The only actions that will count towards meeting MPP for the LEA are contributing actions. It is critical to ensure that the minimum proportionality percentage is budgeted in its totality or more in the 24-25 LCAP in order to meet statutory requirements and to have an approvable LCAP. Today's money for today's child is always a good reminder about MPP. So what constitutes a contributing action? If an action addresses the unique needs of the unduplicated student group or groups identified as being served by the action and is designed to improve the outcomes of the unduplicated student group or groups identified as being served by the action to a greater extent than other students, and is either a quantitative increase or a qualitative improvement, then it is considered to be a contributing action. The actions included as contributing to meeting the increased or improved services requirement must be indicated in two areas in the LCAP as such, within the goals and action section of the LCAP with a Y or an N, as well as in the action tables with a yes or a no. Note the two blue squares here on the right of the slide. There are three types of contributing actions. A contributing action can be as far-reaching across the entire LEA, it can be offered across an entire school, or limited to identified students. The determination of the scope of a contributing action is made by the LEA. An LEA-wide action is provided to all students and upgrades the entire educational program of an LEA. These actions may be referred to as LEA-wide, district-wide, county-wide, or charter-wide action. School-wide actions may be provided at certain schools or to certain grade spans within the LEA. Please note that an action being provided on an LEA-wide or a school-wide basis must be designed to benefit low-income English learners and/or foster youth students to a greater extent than students who are not low-income ELs or foster youth. This ensures that the wide action is principally directed in meeting the needs and goals for unduplicated students of the LEA, the students who generated the funding. A limited action is provided to only one or more of the unduplicated student groups. Only the identified students from the unduplicated student group or groups will receive and benefit from the action. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of contributing actions for our unduplicated students in the 24-25 LCAP, and we know how to define the scope of the action as limited, LEA-wide, or school-wide, we're ready to complete the required descriptions in the Increased or Improved section. The required description section is divided into 3 subsections: LEA-wide and school-wide actions, limited actions, and additional concentration grant funding. And let's begin with the first subsection, LEA-wide and school-wide actions. Here, the LEA will provide the required explanation for all LEA-wide and/or school-wide contributing actions. Notice that once the action is identified by goal and action number, there are 3 prompts that need to be addressed: the identified need, how the action is designed to address that need, and why it is being provided on an LEA-wide or school-wide basis, and the metric or metrics that will monitor its effectiveness. So let's take a moment to unpack these prompts. In the first prompt, outlined here in red, LEAs provide an explanation of the unique identified needs of the LEA's unduplicated student group or groups for whom the action is principally directed. An LEA demonstrates how an action is principally directed towards an unduplicated student group or groups when the LEA explains the needs, conditions, or circumstances of the unduplicated student group or groups identified through a needs assessment. A meaningful needs assessment includes, at minimum, analysis of applicable student achievement data and educational partner feedback. In the second prompt, outlined in blue, LEAs provide an explanation of how the action, as designed, will address the unique identified need or needs of the LEA's unduplicated student group or groups for whom the action is principally directed. In addition, the LEA must provide the rationale for why this action is being provided on an LEA-wide or school-wide basis. Please note that if in the Goals and Actions section, the description of the contributing action includes an explanation of how the action is principally directed towards the identified student group or groups, with all the other requirements for this prompt, then the LEA may state as such in this blue section. And in the last column outlined in green, the LEA identifies the metric or metrics that will be used to measure the progress and effectiveness of the action. Here is an example of a sufficient response for an LEA-wide action. And the next slide will point out the necessary components for each of the prompts. Okay, the necessary prompts. In the identified needs section, student achievement data and educational partner feedback is provided and explained as part of the identified need. In prompt 2, the reader is provided a succinct and sufficiently detailed description as to how the action will address the identified need and why this contributing action is being provided on an LEA-wide or school-wide basis. And to note that in the last column, the metrics that will be used to monitor the effectiveness of this contributing action are clearly identified. Now, there is an additional requirement that must be addressed in the action description for LEAs whose unduplicated pupil percentage is below a certain threshold. If you are a school district with less than 55% unduplicated pupils, then for all LEA-wide actions, you must also describe how the LEA-wide action is the most effective use of funds and provide a basis for the determination with supporting research, experience, or educational theory in the action description column, previously shown with a blue border, hence the blue star, in the LEA-wide table prompt 2. If a school-wide contributing action will be implemented at a school site with less than 40% unduplicated pupils, then for all school-wide actions at that school site, you must do the same. Describe how the LEA-wide action is the most effective use of funds and provide a basis for the determination with supporting research, experience, or educational theory in the action description column. Again, the blue star, the blue outline. And one final cautionary reminder before Helen continues with the next subsection. Conclusory statements are not allowed when providing an explanation for contributing actions in any of the prompts. According to the Webster Merriam Dictionary, a conclusory statement consists of or relates to a conclusion or assertion for which no supporting evidence is offered. And many of us probably around now are recalling a famous quote by W. Edwards Deming, who is also well known for his instrumental work on the continuous quality improvement and PDSA model. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So please note that to ensure an approvable LCAP, conclusory statements are not sufficient. Just saying an action is principally directed or that it is effective does not make it so. And simply stating that an LEA has a high enrollment percentage of a specific student group or groups is not sufficient when identifying needs. Enrolling students is not the same as serving students. All contributing actions must be focused on the identified needs of the unduplicated students, regardless of how many there are. Scope, LEA-wide, school-wide, or limited, is determined based on the services provided, not based on the number of students receiving the services. Okay, I know that was a lot. Thank you so much for your attention, and Helen will continue on with limited actions.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you everyone for staying with us so far. Just hang in there, just one more section after this, so please hang in with us. So this part is the increase or improve service section is the limited actions. As mentioned, remember, limited actions serve only one or more of the unduplicated student groups, such as that services may be provided to, again, low income or English learners and or foster youth students at all schools in the LEA, specific schools in the LEA, or even specific grade spans within the LEA. So the response for this prompt is organized in a table format similar to the table in the LEA-wide or the school-wide subsection as Anita discussed earlier. For all limited actions in the plan, there is a table to complete the 3 prompts. As mentioned, if the LEA has provided this required description in the action description, state as such within the table. If the LEA has no limited action, then LEA can write not applicable in the prompt. So let's take a closer look at the 3 prompts in the table. First box in red, in addressing the unique needs of unduplicated student groups identified through the LEA's needs assessment, an explanation must be provided. Remember that a meaningful needs assessment at a minimum includes analysis of applicable student achievement data and feedback from your educational partners. In the blue box, the action must be designed to address these unique needs. Identified needs in section of the unduplicated students must be served. And finally, in green, identify the metrics employed for measurement. Here is an example of a sufficient limited action response. And we're going to take a look at it closer in the next slide. So for limited actions, LEAs, again, must incorporate the identified needs. This example illustrates the articulation of needs using combination of student achievement data and feedback from your educational partners. And also in the second column, the rationale for offering the action, LEA-wide, offering the action. And take a look, LEA-wide or school-wide action, why it's not there, is absent because this action is only for the students, unduplicated student groups. And finally, notice that there is a specific metric to monitor the effectiveness, and it's clear as to which goal and the metric this action is tied to. The second prompt in the limited action subsection is to address any actions with planned percentage of improved services. For limited actions without any funding associated, regardless of funding source, meaning no federal, no state, nor local, nor any other funds associated with it, then this limited action may have per plan percentage of improved services. For each action with an identified plan percentage of improved services, identify goal and action number and describe the methodology that was used to determine that percentage of increased or improved services. The LEA must describe the methodology that you used to determine the contribution of the action towards the proportional percentage. The percentage of improved services for an action corresponds to the amount of LCFF funding that the LEA estimates it would expend to implement the action if it were funded. So let's take a look at this example. If there was a volunteer to do a work of reading intervention that would otherwise have been done by a school staff, and the LEA determined that this action would have costed $450,000, to calculate the planned percentage of improved services, LEA would take the estimated cost of that additional staff by the total amount of the LCFF base grant. In this case, $24,193,548. Therefore, the planned percentage of improved services for this action could be 1.86%. Keep in mind that this again is for limited actions without any funds associated with it, and please to use with caution as this methodology needs to be clearly delineated. And the last subsection the required of this section is the additional concentration grant funding. Adrian and Anita shared earlier in this presentation about this concentration grant add-on. This prompt calls for the LEA to describe how it is using the additional concentration grant add-on funds to increase the number of staff who provide direct services to students at schools with enrollment of unduplicated students that is greater than 55%, as compared to the number of staff who provide direct services to students with an enrollment of unduplicated students that is equal or less than 55%. An LEA that does not receive concentration grant or the concentration add-on must indicate that this prompt is not applicable. Now, for LEAs that do receive the additional 15% concentration grant funding, the LEA must identify the goal and action numbers of the actions in the LCAP that the LEA is implementing to meet the requirement to increase the number of staff who's providing direct services to the schools with an enrollment of unduplicated students that is greater than 55%. The intent behind these funds is to provide much needed assistance to schools with high counts of unduplicated students who need additional support to achieve the same outcome as their grade level peers. An LEA that does not have a comparison school from which to describe how it is using the concentration grant add-on funds, such as a single school LEA or an LEA that only has schools with an enrollment of unduplicated students that is greater than 55%, must describe how it is using the funds to increase the number of credentialed staff, classified staff, or both, including custodial staff who provide direct services to students at selected schools, and the criteria used to determine which schools require additional staffing support. If an LEA has no comparison schools because every school in the district has this unduplicated percentage greater than 55%, a sufficient response would indicate an explanation about the criteria or methodology that the LEA used to determine which schools require additional staffing support. In the event that an additional concentration grant is not sufficient to increase staff providing direct services, the LEA must describe how it is using the funds to retain staff providing direct services to students at a school with an enrollment of unduplicated students that is greater than 55%. Most likely, larger districts would not be positioned to this approach. The last part of the improved service section is the staff to student ratio table. This table is only completed by the LEAs that are receiving the additional concentration grant funding and also have comparison schools. Single schools or LEAs that have no comparison schools, for example, each had an enrollment of unduplicated students above 55%, are not responsible for completing the table as they do not have any comparison schools. And again, if an LEA that does not receive an additional funds, please indicate not applicable. In this table, LEAs will provide staff to student ratio, classified staff, and for certificate staff who providing direct services to students with concentration of unduplicated students, that's 55% or less, and staff to student ratio for the schools that are greater than 55%. In both cases, LEAs may group its schools by grade span, like elementary, middle, junior high, or high schools, or as applicable to the LEA. Please note that for both certificate and classified calculations, the staff to student ratio is based on the number of FTE staff and the number of enrolled students as counted on the first Wednesday in October of each year. So as we wrap up this section, it's evident that this topic that sparks numerous questions and covers various aspects. Please join us on day 2 as we take more in-depth a look at determining the needs, conditions, and circumstances for our unduplicated student groups. And we'll delve into methods for determining the unique needs for our students. All right, so now without further ado, I'll hand it over to Evan and Hillary for local indicators overview.
Thank you, Helen. Your lights went off as if on cue. It's 10:30 time. We do note the time and we apologize. It's 11:30, I should say. For those of you who have to leave, we completely understand. Just know we are recording and we will send the recording out to all participants just as soon as possible. So if you have to leave, we apologize. But we do want to cover the local indicators and give you a brief overview of those. So what are the local indicators? Next slide, please. For the priority areas that are identified in LCFF for which there is no state reported data available, the state board has approved local indicators that are based on information and data that each LEA collects locally. The local indicators are required for all LEAs, including charter schools. Local indicators are not reported for individual schools with the exception of charter schools or also single school districts. There are 7 local indicators reported on the dashboard. However, 2 of these, priorities 9 and 10, are only reported by county offices of education. The local indicators that are reported by districts and charter schools are the following. Priority 1, basic services and conditions, with which LEAs report information related to whether students have access to curriculum-aligned instructional materials and whether students have access to safe, clean, and functional school facilities. For this indicator, the CDE also now populates each LEA's teaching assignment monitoring outcome, or TAMO, data on the dashboard. Priority 2, implementation of state academic standards, with which an LEA reports information related to how it's implementing the state-adopted academic content and performance standards for all students, and how the programs and services provided by the LEA enable English learners and students to improve their understanding of academic course content and their expertise in using the English language. Priority 3, parent and family engagement, with which LEAs report information related to how they are promoting parental participation in programs, including how they are building relationships between school staff and families, building partnerships to improve student outcomes, and seeking parent input in decision-making. Priority 6, school climate, as measured by a local survey, with which an LEA reports information related to student, parent, and teacher perceptions of school safety and connectedness. And finally, priority 7, access to a broad course of study, with which an LEA reports the extent to which all students have access to and are enrolled in a broad course of study, including English, math, social science, science, visual and performing arts, health, and physical education. Next slide.
All right, the State Board of Education has approved the performance standard for each local indicator that an LEA is required to meet, which are pretty straightforward and consist of 3 separate but very important components, which include annually measuring progress in meeting the requirements of a specific LCFF priority. Additionally, in which these results are to be reported as part of a non-consent item at the same public meeting in which the LCAP is adopted by the local governing board. And those results need to be reported and published to the public through the dashboard using the adopted self-reflection tools for each local indicator. Here's an implementation timeline that provides an overview of a sequence of events from the previous slide that transpire over time with regards to measuring, reporting, and publishing local indicator information. As you can see, these 3 actions do not take place in a single month. Rather, they are points in time intended to give depth and breadth to a much bigger process. Between fall and spring, there are several significant steps associated with data analysis that will need to take place that require time and attention. On or before July 1st, LEAs are reminded once again, the results are to be reported as part of a non-consent item at the same public meeting of the local governing board in which the LCAP is adopted. Once that has occurred, the dashboard coordinator can begin reporting the local indicator results to the dashboard. Next slide, please. And as you can see in this diagram, it speaks to and outlines the process for annually measuring progress. Initially becoming familiar with the local indicator requirements and self-reflection tools will help and guide the identification of specific data, along with determining a process for how best to collect that data. Within this data analysis process, it is important and encouraged to disaggregate the data when appropriate, at which point the findings are used to report progress using the self-reflection tools to determine needs and to inform comprehensive planning in the LCAP. Keep in mind that priority 3 must involve educational partners in this process, which should be taken into consideration when planning. And speaking to performance ratings, provided an LEA satisfies the performance standard for each local indicator, the dashboard will automatically assign a performance level of met. If an LEA does not meet the performance standards, the dashboard will automatically assign a performance level of not met or not met for 2 or more years as applicable. The 2024 updated self-reflection tool and performance standard for each local indicator can be found on the CDE webpage linked on this slide. Here you have the option if you'd like to either download them individually or as one larger guide. The website also provides specific definitions, descriptions, and additional information such as frequently asked questions and links to register for future webinars hosted by the CDE.
And if you squinted closely, you will notice that the self-reflection tool was updated just this month. And I want to get into a couple of those changes that are important to note, because the self-reflection tool was just updated following a state board meeting. So next slide, please. So the first change we want to draw your attention to is a change to priority 1. As previously noted, one of the performance standards, of course, is that the local indicators are reported to the local governing board at the same meeting as the adoption of the LCAP. Now that the CDE is reporting each LEA's teacher assignment monitoring outcome data on the dashboard, this data, the TAMO data, is expected to be shared with the governing board as part of this local indicator. However, we know from prior years, it takes a long time to generate the TAMO data. It pushes right up to the deadlines. So since this data takes time to produce, the state board has indicated that if this data is unavailable at the time an LEA reports its local indicators to their governing board, the LEA must report this data at the next available meeting of the governing board after the TAMO data is released. Next slide, please. Additionally, there's a change to priority 6, the school climate survey. At their most recent meeting just last week, the State Board of Education adopted a revised self-reflection tool for school climate. This tool, as you may remember, was initially updated in March of last year, 2023, with two major changes. First, that an LEA administer a local climate survey on an annual basis. That was increased from a biannual basis to measure student perceptions of school safety and connectedness, and that the LEA report the survey's disaggregated data by the student groups identified in Education Code 52052. Based on some input that the State Board received from both the CDE and climate survey vendors such as WestEd, the board further refined the tool last week to specify that LEAs are only required to report disaggregated data by student groups when such data is available. So, and you may want to check out that agenda item to see some of the rationale and reasons, but I know a lot of vendors have adjusted accordingly to be able to report that out. Next slide. As noted, we'll go into the other performance standards. As we noted earlier, the second performance standard is the local indicator that you're reporting to the governing board as a non-consent item at the same meeting in which the LCAP is adopted. So consistent with the LCAP requirements, this reporting must occur on or before July 1st of each year. And note that any LEA that reports a presentation date occurring after July 1st, even if it's inadvertent, when they submit their local indicators on the dashboard, will earn a rating of not met or not met for 2 or more years as applicable. The reason you can do this is because the system does not prohibit you from reporting a date after July 1st, so you want to be careful. A rating of not met for 2 or more years, as you may know, could result in an LEA being identified as eligible for differentiated assistance. The third performance standard is reporting to the public via the dashboard. And to meet this performance standard, LEAs must upload their local indicator using the CDE's My CDE Connect portal. Prior to this reporting, LEAs must have a designated dashboard coordinator on that CDE's My CDE Connect webpage, and that dashboard coordinator must have been approved by the LEA superintendent or administrator. And once approved, the dashboard coordinator will be able to report the LEA's local indicator data to the dashboard within the window, and that change in the window, which we talked about earlier, will make it important change and should make it easier. I think if you're currently a dashboard coordinator, your access will still be viable when the window opens. Next slide. As we noted on the prior slide, the timeline for submission of local indicators to the dashboard was revised this year to better align with the approval of the LCAP. It's expected that the LEAs will be able to upload their local indicators between June 15th and August 15th. Yay. Another important change to note is that starting with the 2024 dashboard, LEAs will not be allowed to request changes to the information reported for their local indicators after the closure of the 2024 local indicator reporting window. So it's the responsibility of each LEA to ensure that their local indicator information is reported accurately when they upload to the dashboard. And finally, we just wanted to share another tool. We're not going to dive into it, but we have a link here. We have another resource, our local indicator guidance and measurement tool, in addition to our local LCAP metric inventory tool. We'll dive deeper in those. And so we encourage you on day 2 to join us for that. And we'll give you a deeper overview of both of those tools. And with details of day 2, I'm handing it over to Adrian.
Great. Thank you so much, Evan and Hillary. Again, we want to remind you that the LCAP workshop day 2 is on Thursday, February 8th, 10 to 11:30. We really want to thank you for hanging in there for today as we went over a bit. And so again, we want you to complete the evaluation for today's workshop. Here's the link, and again, we will look at it. We will determine if there are things that you still would like us to cover or perhaps clarify from today's workshop. Besides having the questions placed in the chat, and we will respond to those. We definitely want to hear your feedback and any additional areas that you would need extra support in terms of your LCAP and the development of your LCAP. So again, we want to give you time for that. And again, thank you everyone for, if you're still here, hanging in there with us, and we will be sending out the Q&A as soon as possible. And also today we'll be sending out the link in case any of your colleagues did need to leave due to some time constraints. So again, we want to thank all of you for being here. We want to invite you to come back for part 2, which will be different content, and deeper. And again, we want to thank our colleagues, Evan and Hillary, for joining. And also thank you to the team. As you know, it takes a village, and we enjoy working as a village. So thank you so much. Have a great day. And, we're here for if you have any questions or concerns. Thank you.